We do a gallery view with the idea of the listener is as important as the speaker.
Yeah, I was just sitting there like, what does Creator have in store for us today?
Creators just giving us a message to connect. I don't know.
Yeah, slow down,
Linear time is a colonial construct.
listen outward. There's more than just us here.
I've had many different connections to that aspect of my culture, but I've felt very disconnected from the land itself.
Mm.
It reminds me of something that Emerald says often, where healing happens in community. And like they say here in the downtown east side, culture saves lives.
Be that
Um,
community for other people. You need to cultivate it within yourself as well.
Uh, my body is my land.
Welcome. We are Living Proof, experience as evidence in pain research, where people who live with pain get to ask the questions and guide the conversation instead of just answering the surveys. This podcast is brought to you by PEPR, Partnership for the Engagement of People in Pain Research. The PEPR Partnership is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I'm Desmond Williams, this is Emerald Asuncion, and this is episode 3 of Living Proof. In today's episode, titled Cultural Pathways to Meaningful Engagement, we are in conversation with Dr. Vanessa Ambtman-Smith, Plains Cree from Treaty 6. Vanessa is an assistant professor at Western University and a health geographer whose work sits at the intersection of Indigenous health, healing, and pain research.
Vanessa is someone who has spent over 25 years bridging Indigenous communities and healthcare institutions. Her doctoral research, Weaving Indigenous Knowledge into Pain Research, Cultural Pathways to Meaningful Engagement, explores how we can create spaces for Indigenous people to share their experiences with pain in ways that are reciprocal, culturally safe, and rooted in ceremony. We were able to meet and build relations with Vanessa over the week prior to filming this episode, and so, in the spirit of the metaphor of weaving, our threads frayed on filming day, and we recorded in speaker view with just one speaker on the screen at a time. So, we've woven together a visual tapestry that spotlights moments of relationality that happened between us all throughout the week in complement and connection to the final conversation. Thank you for listening.
And when things don't go exactly the way we want to, always a
Mhm.
good reminder to take a moment to come back to our breath, to ourselves, maybe with some medicine, so that we can get back to what we're here for.
Mm.
So, yeah, why don't we take a couple easy breaths just before we get started? Welcome, Vanessa. Yeah, we're so happy to have you today. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a really good week of connecting. And yeah, we're just so happy you're here. Thanks for taking the time. The conversations we've had this week have been less like planning and more like relation building. And that's what this podcast is about. So thank you for being here. So why don't we start off with you? You can tell us a bit more about yourself and where you're coming from and what living proof means to you.
Yeah. Well, Miigwech, I appreciate being hosted. And I just want to say I've been grateful to get the chance to know both of you over the past couple of days because we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. And it really makes me hopeful about continuing to support this work, to be part of this team. Like I feel a place of belonging and safety with both of you. So I just want to say miigwech, and I'm very grateful for that. So I'm just going to introduce myself in the way that I've been taught through the elders that have helped to provide me with some sort of language. And what I use is Anishinaabe, and even though my place of origin is actually Cree territory and Métis territory in Treaty 6, but I'll proceed. Ani, Bojo, Nishu Vanessa Kandishnakas, Nimki and Dodum. So what I said is my English name is Vanessa Ambtman-Smith, that I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory. I'm of mixed ancestry, so I'm Cree, Plains Cree and Métis on my mother's side, and I'm European, broadly Eastern European, Polish, Ukrainian on my father's side. Although I was born in Alberta and lived there for a short time, I was primarily raised on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So I'm definitely from the Great Plains and someone who raised on the prairies, and that's a important part of my life. But I'm also a mother, a wife, a sister, and an auntie. And you know, as a Indigenous Cree woman, I don't think I've always been able to claim those identities with confidence because I am one of thousands of Indigenous people who were adopted out during the 60s scoop. And I was raised by non-Indigenous parents by design. So I was adopted out to a non-Indigenous family in the late 70s. And I was raised by two parents who were immigrants, a mother from Trinidad and Tobago and a father from the Netherlands. And looking at how growing up as a visibly Indigenous Cree woman being raised on the prairies, there were so many layers of displacement. My adoptive family provided a very seemingly privileged life, but truthfully, I often felt like a visitor in my own home and never fully connected emotionally with people around me. And I've come to understand through my own work and my own lived experience and my own scholarship that having my first relationship was not with my Cree mother. It was with a hospital. And so I was born into the Salvation Army Hospital in Calgary, and I was scooped from her arms before she ever really had a chance to connect or to hold me. And I spent 17 days in the hospital as an infant while I was going through the child welfare process before I was placed in my adoptive family. So when I think about my first experiences and my first relationship, that was to be held captively or to be in captive care. And I think that's really shaped the way that I relate to people around me. I really have had to work hard to understand how to connect in a human way and and I spend most of my time building relationships. And I think that's been a really important part of my life. And I think it helps to inform my trajectory. I feel that I've moved from a place of survivance to thrivance, but it's taken many decades to do. I think about my lived experience with addictions, with precarity, poverty, but also with living with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and really not knowing much about that condition throughout my life and just being told to tough it up and to keep moving and pushing through any fatigue, pain, going to the hospital over and over, trying to find out what's happening and what's wrong. And even the way that we talk when we talk with people who have experience, being able to convey the depth and the strength of those voices as the evidence, right? Because there's no greater body of evidence than, in my opinion, people's personal accounts, especially in the absence in my world of having reliable sources of data. I mean, data points really don't do justice for this type of work, anyways. And I know I'm in Thrivance now because I'm well enough to ask for help and I'm well enough to understand my limits, my boundaries, and to take the time that I need to care for myself. And even as a mother, it's hard to always feel justified in taking that time. But I think that if I don't do that, no one else is going to do that for me. And I've worked so hard, my ancestors worked so hard to survive genocide so that I could be here today. And walking through the life that I've had and learning from all the visits to the emergency room where I was ignored, dismissed, looked at with disgust. And there was a point in my life in my late 20s where I proclaimed that I would never enter a hospital again unless I was brought there on a stretcher because I had been treated so poorly. And that the transformation that has come since then has really been about reclaiming my identity, my culture, my sense of belonging, and doing all the work to recognize that I'm not somebody who is pathologically sick. I'm somebody who has, yes, I carry some intergenerational trauma, but I also carry intergenerational wisdom, and I have the capacity to be lovable, to be helped, to be supported. And I've had a chance to go back and perform the ceremonies to reclaim my infant self from that hospital when I was isolated and in captive care. And all of that has really helped to transform me into somebody who feels their worthiness, their power, and that survivance and that move from survivance to thrivance is the living proof that we all have the capacity to be loved, that we all have the capacity to ask for help, that we all have the capacity to accept that help, and we all have the capacity to reclaim ourselves regardless of what our past experiences are and also to heal. And I think the healing is the biggest gift to my life in knowing that I don't have to rely on Western biomedicine and hospitals and clinicians to do that work for me, but that there are things that I can do and that I can access through my intergenerational wisdom and from the knowledge of who I am and where I come from here on Turtle Island, that I can harness that medicine and that I can use that medicine and I can move that through my body in ways that allow me to continue to fight and to be present and to use my voice when I need to and to show up and to be the mother that I've always wanted to be. And these are important concepts because where I came from and what I've been through sometimes would lead me to forget that I have that capacity. And even the English language is almost sometimes being used to help disguise the pain or the discomfort or the harm that I've experienced. And I'm just grateful I'm able to express it now in ways that are useful and hopefully helpful for others. I think that's my mission in life is to reclaim spaces in hospitals so that they're not harmful and they're helpful. And I want my kids to be able to enter into a hospital to access care without having it withheld, without being stereotyped, and without having to fight for their human rights. And that how I do that is by showing up. There's so many different ways.
Thank you. That's such a rich introduction. I really appreciate you being so open with us right away and giving us so much of you. And I'm so honored to be your colleague. And I feel like so much relatable content from, we have very different experiences, but the way that they hit
Mm.
inside, I can feel that.
I would love to hear a little bit more about each one of you and like where you're coming from. If you would be comfortable in also taking some time to talk a little bit about yourselves to me.
Let's see, where can I begin? It's funny because yesterday I had book club and it's pre-colonial Filipino spirituality. And yesterday it was about who am I, and everyone did their intros of where they're coming from in terms of the place that they live in, the things that they've learned from the relationships where they are,
Mhm.
and then taking it back to where our parents came from afterwards.
Mhm.
And then also at the same time, finding myself in a perfectionism of keeping it within 3 to 4 minutes and making sure that I'm not taking up too much space. But yeah.
Are you born and raised in Vancouver?
Oh, no, I was born in New Brunswick.
Okay.
Yeah, so my parents are, my mom's Bicolano from like southern Philippines, and my
Mhm.
dad is Masbateño from an island across the way. His father is from Loag City, which is in the northern part of Luzon. So I'm
Mhm.
Ilocano, Masbateño, and Bicolano, and diasporic. And yeah, born in New Brunswick. My parents came here in 1975, so I was born in 82. And then they moved to Edmonton when I was 5. We came here for Expo 86, and then we came here every year after that. So I pretty much knew that I was going to live here when I got older. When I was 12, going on 13, I went to the Philippines for the second time. So I've been there for 2 months of my life. When I went there to my mom's area, it really looked like Vancouver in terms of the ocean and the mountain being near each other. And so when I remember being like, I'm definitely going to move to Vancouver when I'm old enough because I can't speak this language and I feel like a tourist. And what a weird feeling.
When I hear a lot of other people talk about their experiences as well, either diaspora or dispossession from their traditional territories, people talk about certain geographical. So I'm a geographer. So we talk about certain geographical features like their mountain. So you were saying, like in Vancouver, you saw like you have your mana or your mountain, which reminds you of your homelands. And someone actually who had shared recently at an Indigenous conference called Reclaiming Indigenous Ecologies of Love that I was at said, also diaspora, said, my body is my land. And I was like, I have been carrying that with me since that time because I really need to feel that and to hear that and to know that. The Great Plains is its own very specific geography, or that's where I feel comfortable. And like I draw
Mhm.
my strength from representations of that. But I can see like Vancouver, you've got the water, you've got the mountains,
I mean, I was there from 5 to 22, so there's
Mhm.
definitely like a place in my heart for that. And yeah, to so many things you're saying. Also new in a diagnosis that just came about 2 years ago that I've been navigating and within identity as well. I'm glad that it took me into this work
Mhm.
because before that, for a long time, I worked in medical cannabis patient advocacy and was not in acknowledgement of my own pain at the time in the way that took me to creating relationships to affirm diagnoses and things like that. I was just like doing different modalities of body work and
Mhm.
medicine. And because we worked in this place that had all these alternative medicines, I found a lot of tools along the way. In that work, I did outreach, education, frontline work. Actually, I met Desmond there because he was a member. It was like November 2019, and I just couldn't work anymore. So I started doing art and leaning more into my art collective, Katara Filipino Indigenous Art Collective Society. The two founders were adopted by the Bagobo Tagabawa of Mount Apo in southern Mindanao.
Okay.
Then I got into Indigenous crafting with all of my neighbor friends, and
Mhm.
I started leaning into doing performance. I learned how to DJ. I was performing with our friend Kim Mortal, who's a rapper, singer, songwriter, Renaissance artist. It just felt like decolonizing in action, just being able to
Mhm.
say, like, yeah, saying Kim's poetry out loud is amazing. Also, I was working closely with my friend Elder Kat Norris. And she passed in 2022, but the reason why we reconnected over the pandemic was because she wanted to create an urban indigenous art collective for Salish people in the downtown east side, which is my neighborhood.
Mhm.
So with Kat, I ended up making a few different Salish dresses, one with
Mhm.
paddles. I made a jingle dress, a fancy shawl, like stacks of star blankets.
Mhm.
Um,
That's very
A bunch of
advanced.
stuff. Yeah, a bunch of stuff,
Yeah.
a bunch of stuff. Yeah, I'm excited about all the relationships that are being built and the things that we get to create. Just bringing it all together with a holistic lens and with all of our experiences, and knowing that I have people like both of you in this work that I get to uplift through that is very motivating. So I feel like excited to do a good job.
Mhm.
And that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at today. And
You're uniquely qualified based on all the beautiful things that you've done and who
yeah.
you are. Mhm.
And it's funny you both talking about being out in the plains. I've only ever been out there a couple of times. I'm born and raised here in BC. I grew up in Coquitlam, and I'm out in East Van as well, just down the street from Emerald. And the times that I was out there, it felt so strange to me just how far you could see without it being interrupted.
I know,
And for
exactly.
me, it felt like a little
This,
too wide
oh,
open
this is
and like
making a noise,
almost, oh,
by the way.
we love that. But I felt too wide open. I almost felt like too vulnerable, not having mountains around to almost protect me from whatever whatever perceived out there. And funny enough, like I can see the mountains from where I am right now. My dad's side, he's from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's an island in the southern Caribbean. It's only 8 by 11 miles, and people only live on the outside because it's a volcano and it's all mountains. And like right there is always a mountain. You are just at the mountains wherever you are in St. Vincent as well, because it's something similar to a lot of the small places here in Canada. As beautiful and quiet and rich in culture as it may be, those of us who sometimes have a lot of ambition feel as though there are just not as many opportunities or things that we would like to do in those spaces. And one of those interesting spaces to exist where we feel disconnected from the places we're from because we have these modern ambitions, you could say. It's kind of how I feel sometimes in relation to some of the land on my mom's side. My mom is mixed Indigenous and European, and we're from Scuppa territory in the interior here in BC, and near Lytton, Ashcroft, Spence's Bridge area. And I've had many different connections to that aspect of my culture, but I've felt very disconnected from the land itself. Last summer was actually the first time I'd been back since I was a kid, even though it's only like 3.5 hours away. Just for some reason, I had not gone back. And most of my family who's up there is in Lytton at this point. And about 5 years ago, Lytton basically burnt down completely, and then a year later, the rest of it got burned down. And so, like, I didn't really have many memories from what it was like before, and then going recently and seeing it just be like bare was like a really interesting experience for me in wanting to find ways that I can reconnect with it a little bit deeper. And also, similar to what Emerald had said, many of the things you shared really resonated with me. The pain that I deal with is I have ankylosing spondylitis. It's an autoimmune condition, and it's something I inherited from my mom, who has been suffering for many years as well. And she has shared on several occasions the kind of guilt that she feels that, like, she is, you could say, some of the source of it, despite it's not like it was intentional. It's not like that this was what we were trying to do, but it is the unfortunate reality. But for me, I feel so lucky that my mom has the experience of what I'm dealing with as well, because I've learned so much from her in how to continue functioning, how to continue growing with the things that sometimes limit you within this experience of living with pain. I'm the PWLE co-director because my qualifications aren't through institution, it's through my 30 years of living with pain and the many things that I've gone through, both the suffering but also those pieces of hope that brought me to this space where I'm able to give back and support people in a certain capacity when it comes to this work. And I think one of the things that you said about speaking from your lived experience as well, as a person who on many occasions has been invited to things for Black people or for Indigenous people, sharing my perspective on something, the difficult position sometimes you get put in to speak on behalf of or as a representative of, and being able to have that personal perspective, the lived experience, and like being that the foundation of what your work is based off of makes it just so much easier for us to be able to connect in that relational way, because we're not there's not this pressure put on to like be the perfect representative or this version of yourself that you think you're supposed to be on behalf of. And it just gives us so much more space to be genuine. And at the same time as well, just with the whole theme of what this podcast is, living proof, that's the foundation of what we're trying to talk about in this particular space.
So a good segue into your work because, yeah, healing is necessary and absolutely birthright for everyone. Like, we need to be there for each other. And in your work, weaving Indigenous knowledge into pain research, can you tell us a bit more about what that weaving looks like?
I think the concept of weaving is really an act of resurgence and an act of reclamation, acknowledging that even based on what I shared earlier, that we have access to a really important and health promoting relative in all of our lives, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that connection to the land and the ability to use the different gifts that the earth offers us, even from the waters to plant-based medicines to there's so much healing capacity and so much science around the types of medicines that are available to us through connecting to the land. The weaving is just noticing that we're at a place in time where it's important for us to pick up those tools and to pick up those gifts from the earth and start to use them again, because this is knowledge that we had taken from us. We had our health, and our healthcare as Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island was rooted in the land. And when Europeans came to North America and brought with them their practices from Europe and from the West, that Western biomedical system replaced our source of health and healthcare. And it actually took us into institutions, into places that had physical barriers between us and the land. So I think about being in a hospital and I think about the concrete walls around us and I think about the physical separation and just being in those clinical spaces. They're so stark and sterile that we often forget that we have that relationship with the land that is so important, so central to promoting our health. So I think the concept of weaving Indigenous knowledge is telling us that we need to go back out on the land or we need to find ways to bring the land in the indoors, even in unlikely places such as the hospital or institutional environment, so that we can reestablish that relationship that sustains us, that teaches us about how to care for ourselves, for one another, and all of creation. And that by doing that, we can start to reimagine what engagement in research about pain could look like. That we can change the conditions that we bring people into when we have those conversations. And I believe that by doing that, by transforming that physical space, we're able to really start to understand and listen and learn about many more ways that people have to share with us about what appropriate conversations about lived experience, about experiences of pain, or about just realities of being Indigenous in urban places like Toronto could look like. And we know a lot of other realities These are the realities that are fed through knowledge about Indigenous contemporary health, education, housing. All of the social determinants of health have really helped us to understand that Indigenous people as a whole, and I don't mean to just create a big blanket, generally, there's a lot of statistics about Indigenous people that are quite bleak. They're quite negative. They're quite focused on the deficits. And one of the things that those statistics tell us is that we are not being set up and supported to thrive. And within that, we know Indigenous people experience the highest prevalence of chronic pain in Canada, yet we're systematically excluded from the pain knowledge creation. So our stories are typically not folded into an understanding about what that experience is, what it looks like, what it feels like, and how it manifests. And so I think that alongside our voices being excluded, our knowledge systems are also being dismissed. So, with our voices absent from research that shapes clinical care, you can see how we're not going to be supported within these Western biomedical systems and structures, right? Because there's so little understanding about what this could look like. And I find that people's default setting when they don't understand is to sort of lean into what the education system here has taught them about Indigenous people. And it's so fraught with stereotypes, with myth or colonial narratives, I call them, which are stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the inequity, right? Why are Indigenous people not thriving? Why are Indigenous people, based on these data points, suffering from the poorest health of any population? And then the way that the blanks are filled in are rooted in these long-standing narratives that made it possible for Europeans to come and to colonize this country, is that we're less than. We are less than human. We're not able to feel pain. And that's one of the main narratives, is that we're being told we don't feel pain. We're not as fully human as white settlers who came to Canada. And so even just starting from that assumption that is so deeply rooted and reinforced through the media on the regular basis, we don't we're not coming into environments as a neutral individual. We're coming already carrying this large burden of these colonial myths and stereotypes that we're drug seeking, that we're alcoholic, that we're not good parents. And these stereotypes and colonial narratives are so strong that they can override all the medical and clinical training that individuals receive, because that's how implicit bias works, right? So it sort of predisposes people to make a differential diagnosis that may not be based on the symptoms or how someone's presenting, but rather on their appearance and what we've come to learn or associate with that. And so a big part of weaving Indigenous knowledge into pain research is also finding ways to create our own narratives, our own understandings that are rooted in real and lived experiences of Indigenous people within the context of the full and honest history of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, and how the impacts of colonizations continue to subjugate and oppress people or create the conditions where, our ability to thrive is limited. And once we start to pinpoint that root cause, then we can start to say, well, there must be other things that we can do and include in our knowledge about pain that go well beyond that limited Western biomedical viewpoint. And that must be able to attend to some of the trauma that ongoing and systematic violence would cause. And sometimes we have come to understand that pain is the body's response to an imbalance caused by ongoing trauma caused by intergenerational trauma, caused by many different things. And we need to start to understand and include the fact that pain connects to identity, it connects to indigeneity, and it really must involve relationships with the land. When we are looking at my study, which is focused on urban Indigenous experiences in Toronto, we have to recognize that for the most part, urban Indigenous people are a long way away from their traditional territories or even from having access to that land base. And so that disconnection is a representation of that pain of being disconnected from that relative, from that mother who nurtures us.
Yesterday was my first Sunday where this year I can spend consistent time with my mom, getting deeper into the weaving and the art and the medicine of the cedar. And just the concepts of weaving are coming up a lot these days, as far as, the threads of connection in all of the things in life, weaving together into a tapestry of beautiful music.
And so it's the ache of severed connections and a whole person approach, drawing from our Indigenous knowledge systems that we are weaving into this type of study, means attending to physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. And I think if we can do that, then we can start to hear not just a deficits based approach to treatment, but really start to open up the door to other possibilities and to things that can be done outside of those institutional settings and outside of the world of pharmacare, and start to look at what our ancestors have helped us to understand about how to manage, how to support, and how to shift and move energy that is received as pain in the body.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions about one, the relationship that you spoke about on a couple of occasions that some of us have with the institution of the hospital,
Mhm.
the way that we look at it or perceive it as a place that maybe isn't so helpful for people who look in a certain way sometimes. And what I'm curious about is that this work that you're doing with weaving Indigenous knowledge into pain research, the spaces that you're currently utilizing, from what I understand, are within hospital spaces,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
And so I know that there are many things over the years that I've seen that happen out on the land when it is available, that
Mhm.
sort of thing. But I'm really curious how it is that you worked on your relationship or your relation to the institutional space that you now exist within so that you could create something that does that work to heal that relationship for others who are coming in to seek the work that you're doing. I'm wondering if there were any key strategies or points or things that worked for you
Mhm.
most when it comes to that process that clearly has happened in healing some of your relation, in how you look at the institution as a space that could be supportive or helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point, particularly since it is a paradox that the research shows us that hospitals are unsafe spaces for Indigenous people. And my doctoral research was really based on examining just this and looking at, instead of the overarching context of cultural safety or looking at the ways that anti-Indigenous racism proliferates within the hospital spaces, I decided to sort of flip that onto the positive side and look at, are there any positive things happening within the context of a hospital that support Indigenous health and well-being? And I was very quickly able to pinpoint an ongoing relationship that I've had with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, for over 10 years, where I've been part of their planning process in developing particular spaces that are adapted to support the use of land-based medicines and traditional healing, and to allow for the lighting of a smudge. So having the smoke in the hospital, or being able to have singing and to have drumming and to generate that noise within a mental health hospital. And so it really made me realize that something special had happened in those spaces where people could have access to traditional knowledge, to have relationships with maybe with elders or healers or even aunties when they, like me, come from other places and have had that connection to their family of origin or to their culture severed. And it's funny to say, but I know a lot of people like me who came from other places and found themselves reconnecting to their identity and their culture for the very first time in an urban setting and in these healthcare settings. And so it doesn't surprise me in some ways because hospitals are places we tend to go to as a last resort. They're not places that we want to be. And so often people are in a very vulnerable state. And so it didn't take long for our elders and our knowledge keepers to recognize that we needed something there. We needed to offer people a place of refuge, a place where, when people are at their most vulnerable or potentially even looking at that transition period between living this human existence into moving into the spirit world or spirit realm, or even welcoming new life from a mother into this place, like that we needed to have access to our medicines. And so I attribute a lot of the healing that I've had to elders who have passed on now, like Walter Cook Ba and Asin Vern Harper Ba, Pauline Shirt Ba, and people who really worked hard to connect with Indigenous people in urban spaces and bring them back into a logical place of connection, of identity, of kinship. When I had no relatives present here, they became my relatives and they helped me to understand who I was, to go through the ceremony of naming, to have my name retrieved, to do some of that deep healing so that I could feel secure and solid in my place of belonging and really knowing my logical place on this earth. And that foundation was important for me before any other type of physical health or even treatment was possible. Because before that, I was a shell and I wasn't rooted enough or strong enough to be able to receive help, right? Those were the times when I was really struggling because I wasn't well enough to ask for help. And I certainly didn't think that I was deserving of it. And so there was no way that I would go into a hospital on my own accord because I had never reconciled my relationship with that hospital space. And I had never felt that that was a place I could enter into and be helped. So when I think about the work that I'm doing now, my own process of healing, I know that we have to continue to build these, what we call islands of Indigenous sovereignty within colonial spaces because people need it. Okay, how can we create conditions that support individuals to not only feel, quote, safe or comfortable, but like we're actually looking to offer some reciprocity for people who share the knowledge that they have. This is very sacred knowledge that they carry. Their lived experience is some of the most powerful data that we have. And so to treat it as sacred, we have to look at how we can offer something to those individuals in return for their time, for their knowledge, for that sharing. And so this particular research project, which is the full title is actually Weaving Indigenous Knowledge into Pain Research, Cultural Pathways to Meaningful Engagement. They require that connection, and it has to go well beyond biomedicine because people are coming in who are coming out of the foster care system, who are coming from other places outside of the city and really are vulnerable and that need that extra support. And so CAMH, as an example, has created environments that are tailored to welcome people in and not just welcome people in for treatment or just to make them feel good, but really to immerse them in the knowledge of how to heal and how to come into that understanding about who they are. And so it's no surprise that institutions from prisons to universities to hospitals are starting to create more and more access to space that we call traditional healing spaces because we know they're necessary and we know that people are coming into these environments and that they need that support and they need to go beyond physical and include mental, emotional, and spiritual. So, my experience as an urban adoptee was that I didn't know how to go back to my community. I didn't have that connection with my family. I didn't have people to show me how to do ceremony, how to heal. And it wasn't until I started using these spaces in healthcare that I realized like these are essential. These are critical for health and well-being and not just for people like me. The innovation's not just in creating the spaces, but it's about creating connections, right? It's relationships. It's all the things that I was missing from the time that I was born. And I think that once we can offer people a space of safety and belonging and love and health and healing, that changes everything because we're reclaiming that institutional space and we are creating islands or even small, just a small closet. Sometimes is all we start with, but it's a place where we are able to host our ways of knowing and hold some authority over what happens in that space, even within systems that have historically harmed us. So I feel like that's weaving in my own story with the story of like how hospitals and why we would use hospitals in this research, because I think it's a really beautiful thing and it's a powerful thing to note that it is possible to transform at least parts of those space so that they can become health promoting and healing. I think that the way that I'm starting to look at this research is in a hopeful way and a helpful way rather than in a deficits way. I know it's groundbreaking, right? Like,
Yeah.
why do we have to focus on the doom and the gloom when really maybe we can communicate with people on a human level in a culturally safe space that also offers the benefit of developing a level of relational knowledge that has a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual healing capacity. So that even engaging in the dialogue is going to offer something that is a takeaway and not just about extraction of knowledge from subjects. It's really about saying the individuals who are participating in this study are knowledge holders. They carry the sacred knowledge and they're able to help to build this really powerful environment of communication and connection. And it's that connection piece that is core of what we're trying to establish. Relationality is the way that we are able to support our relatives and our kin. And if that's something that we can facilitate through this process, it's a really big win.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can see the rich tapestry that you're weaving together as you speak, and it just feels so relatable to everything that we're doing and affirming to everything we're doing. And as a non-Indigenous person, it's also very relatable to my experiences here in being diasporic, being a child of parents who were told assimilation is what will bring you success. And every time I asked about anything about my home, they'd say, "Oh, you don't need that here. Don't worry about that." And so similarly, I had to find ways to connect to my culture through people here or often through Indigenous elders here who were just so kind and welcoming and saw that and yeah, and shared their teachings with me. And then I think about how important these spaces are in these environments when there's so many people who are walking around in such a clinical way. When you say like people who need it, it's like also people who don't even know they need it, who will surprise themselves and surprise their colleagues and surprise their patients and their families. That's the tapestry I'm seeing. It's not just in a health space. It's like all of us, we need, it'll shift everyone if people have that normal vision of practices, of spaces, like how you often see like churches and hospitals. And
Exactly.
yeah, so I'm really grateful to hear all of that. I'm actually curious too around the ways of healing that are specific to the area that you're working in, because I'm also seeing that this is replicable, but it's not the same in every place because
Mhm.
there are so many different cultures across this land that need to be platformed and protected, starting in spaces like this. So, yeah, I'd love to hear more about the Anishinaabe Seven Ways of Healing that you've presented in these spaces.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just comment maybe and reflect back on something that you just shared because I feel like it's something that I see when I see you and when I listen to you, but it's just knowing that you were able to be supported and helped with by some of the elders who are indigenous to Turtle Island. But what they saw in you is what I see in you is that you are indigenous as well. But even though your homelands are far, far away from here, you still carry that connection to the land in your body and in your DNA. And
Textiles.
exactly. It's so visible. And I love that because that's the way that we practice those connections to the land and bring our healing from the land into those institutional spaces is that we have to create those proxies. And some of the things that I have that are always present with me are feathers. I have my sage and sweetgrass, and I have some bare root. I have often have stones or crystals that I hold on to, and that's what helps to ground me in I'm at Western University right now, and so this is an institution. And I was told when I started working here that I needed to have my bundle, my medicine bundle with me, which helps to bring together all those tools and those gifts that we have from the land. And so that's a way that I protect myself and that I continue to stay well in this type of place. But it's the same for hospitals. And so I offered the first in-depth case study of any hospital in Canada about about the development and the use and the origins and the meaning of traditional healing spaces because up to this point in time, there has been no study about what these spaces mean and whether they're actually meaningful to the people that they're designed for, which is Indigenous people, right? I learned a lot through that experience. And one of the tensions and one of the critiques is that you can't possibly carry all the diversity of ceremony and culture that can be required to support the different nations of people, but there are some commonalities that we have drawn on. And places like Kemich, we had the guidance of elders who had a very clear vision of the fact that there needed to be a space outside of the hospital directly on the land where you could have a sacred fire and where you could also build a sweat lodge. Because the sweat lodge is one of those unique ceremonies where we're able to activate the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual elements of healing all at once. And the ways that I've come to understand how you can get well through ceremony is through the seven Anishinaabe ways of healing. And so this was a teaching that was gifted by one of the participants of the study and somebody who is also a staff member at CAMH through the Scabe Makwa program, who's trained as both a clinician as well as somebody who carries a significant amount of their own traditional knowledge. And when they came to work at CAMH, they brought such a powerful blend of clinical training and indigedaji alongside their own knowledge systems and practices of traditional healing. And they were able to bring them together. And I think that it became a natural progression to start to see that when the space was created on the land, that they had to start to understand how to adapt the traditional ceremonies that they had learned on their homelands outside of an institutional context and say, okay, well, how can we use our medicine and our powerful ceremonies in ways that are going to help the people, but we're limited to a very long tract of land that is walled by the condo on one side and the walls of the hospital on the other side. And so they're like, well, how can we do this? And so the principle was to create conditions where an individual could be brought into a place where they were first and foremost, where there was some privacy and safety, even though they had other buildings around them. So they were brought inside that sweat lodge on the land, and they were brought into a place where they could shake and they could sweat and they could cry and they could sing and they can move around. And I think all of those things are what really helps to stimulate the nervous system. It can help to bring up things that we've held, memories that we've held, feelings that we've held, and release it back to the land for the creator to take care of. And if you look at some of the different therapeutic modalities used in psychiatry and in mental health, those are all things that are grounded and rooted in the study of how we can help to support people with mental illness and things like that.
I was just asking to share more about like the traditional healing practices. I guess also I'm curious, maybe Desmond is too, because he's a practitioner of helping
Mhm.
people release many things. How do we activate shaking?
Mm, wow. That is a question that goes beyond my knowledge and what research has helped me to come up with. But what I think of is I think of my bundle, and I think of one of the things I have in my bundle, and I have it here, which is a rattle. And when you're using the rattle and you're making that motion, that's a controlled shake, right? And when I think about when we drum or when we dance, those movements are shaking, right? So I know that often we're at odds with some of the Western medicine clinicians who are trained because they really don't have or value a lot of the traditional healing and traditional modalities that are rooted in the land, especially when you say, well, we need to bring patients into use to drum or to sing, to feel the vibrations that creates in the vocal cords and throughout the body, because all of that is a way of release, even laughing.
Mm.
A lot of people, and a lot of Indigenous people in particular that I know who have been through quite difficult circumstances, sometimes we just turn to humor. And that humor is a way of relief, releasing any of that negative energy that if it stays stored in the body can make us sick. I think that those are the things that come to me and help me to understand like why we do those things and why we need those things. And it's very logical to me, but I think that these are the messages that haven't been fully communicated to our relatives who maybe haven't had the benefit of going through ceremony or different types of healing modality outside the confines of that Western biomedical box.
And it's really interesting that you say that because based on the work that I do, a lot of it is based in neuroscience and something called the polyvagal theory that was brought forward by Dr. Stephen Porges. I teach a practice called tension trauma release exercises. And despite the fact that it's based in neuroscience and nervous system understanding within the realm of traditional medicine is still considered very far out and
Mm-hmm.
esoteric and even woo-woo, that like you would be working to soothe the nervous system
Mm-hmm.
and engaging in practices that do what we would call toning the vagus nerve so that we are working on rebuilding our connection with the rest and digest part of our nervous system, whereas we have been in kind of a default mode of the fight or flight, freeze and
Mm-hmm.
fawn reactivity because of environmental things in our lives. And so what I've been working on over the last decade is finding those ways that I can connect that to a cultural sense, because it really is the, you could say, the scientific understanding of what we're doing with these traditional practices of shaking, dancing, singing, laughing, that are all cited as ways that we can actually tone our vagus nerve, our ventral vagal system, so that we can reconnect with our rest and digest and our social engagement aspects of our nervous system. And so within traditional Western medicine, they still really are finding ways to acknowledge that these traditional practices are in fact useful, but within the esoteric realm of Western medicine, it is confirming that all of these practices that we do and have been doing for generations since time immemorial are things that we have been doing to heal as medicine, and the reasons why we survived so long before any of the contact, in ways that there was much thriving and connection and building. It was because we had these practices that connected us to ourselves and helped us work through trauma and stress in a natural way. And the process of being disconnected from our culture is part of what has contributed to the fact that we are some of the most unwell and sickest populations, because we've been so disconnected from those traditional practices that we just do naturally, which are dancing, laughing, singing, crying, and shaking, doing things that are involved in shaking, because there are practices all around the world that we do in community, in healing, in ceremony that involve shaking. But in Western colonial mind frame, shaking doesn't have a positive frame of reference. It's a neurological condition. There's something
Right.
wrong when you're shaking. And so the fact that you are being intentional about incorporating that, and that is one of the ways, the seven Anishinaabe ways of healing. It's such a beautiful connection for me to bring in the work that I've been doing for so long, and recognizing that through the process of doing this work, it has actually been me reconnecting with my culture, but just through a conduit that I didn't recognize was going to be reconnecting with my culture and helping me understand that the things that I do with my family in tradition have as much weight and as much worth as the things that I could be doing otherwise to help manage nervous system activation or anxiety, depression, chronic pain. And that being able to be connected with that and to have support through elders and learning and understanding just makes such a big difference for us. Yeah, it really is interesting how we've had to work on our relation with traditional or with Western medicine in order to find the ways that we are actually proving all the things that they think in Western medicine already are practices that can help what we're trying to solve in the greater
Exactly.
scheme of things. And when it comes to talking to people and policy and whatnot, it in the end will save us so much money when we are incorporating culture into care in institutional spaces, because people will improve.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that has been an obstacle for a long time. Why aren't people improving? And it's because we have not incorporated any culture in those spaces. And so, yeah, just what a beautiful thing it is to be able to have the opportunity to make those spaces and to see in real time what a difference it is making and can make.
Exactly. And research has already shown that cultural wounds demand cultural medicine. And the extension of the research that I've contributed to alongside CAMH and Shgabe Makwa is that if cultural wounds demand cultural medicine demands cultural spaces. So to kind of connect it back to what's happening quite broadly in Canada is that we're in this so-called era of reconciliation, and we have guidance through the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And one of those calls to action is number 22, which calls on healthcare providers, people who have the influence to change the structures of healthcare and institutions to offer traditional medicine to Indigenous patients when they request it. And so, what we've learned is that you can't just bring in some of these things, like these natural things from the earth. You can't just light a match in any hospital at any place and start to light this smudge, which mine contains sage, and use that at bedside. So we've realized that we've had to change those really sterile spaces and start to create our own cultural spaces so that we can bring in the access to the land and those proxies for the land, or even bring people out onto the land itself, right? So I think that people are starting to get it. When I interview non-Indigenous healthcare physicians and administrators who had actually been in the spaces and experienced the ceremony, they got it. Maybe they didn't have the words to sort of share what they felt, but they all understood that something special was happening, that there was a transformation. And those psychiatrists were able to see not only the huge changes in their patients who had access to both the Western medicine, but also the traditional medicine. But they were starting to say that, like, they felt a shift and they felt something that was happening inside of them. They felt peaceful, they felt calm. And I think that was a big shift from how you might expect to feel when you're in a hospital setting, because I think a lot of people feel that anxiety and that tension. So there is something about that commonality across the human experience that can be examined through relationships with the land. But because this is all happening under the so-called umbrella of reconciliation, I think we have to draw a line in the sand, and we have to understand that because the Western medical system has proliferated so much harm for Indigenous people, that we need to put First Peoples first in this context and recognize why this is happening, why these changes are happening, because things had gotten so bad that there was a need for the healthcare system itself to reconcile how it supports and treats Indigenous people. And so that's how these spaces started to come about, because the funding was coming from a response to these calls to action and from these strategic plans that were put in place by these institutions to enact reconciliation, recognizing that first and foremost that they were responsible for harm, not only historically through places like residential schools, Indian hospitals, but in the current context. And so I think that the shift is a big thing. It's happening in many places, but we're really not taking the time to examine not only whether it's effective, but also the potential. And so as we start to shift into looking at Indigenous experience with chronic pain, we want to bring people into those spaces that we know are transformative and that we know have that carry that relationship with Indigenous knowledge systems, with the land and our relatives. So they're well supported in environments. And then we can start to talk about experience of pain. And I think even bringing people into those hospitals itself is going to bring about a response that we need to know about, because that's a big part of the understanding about how we move forward. I would love to see an independent, parallel Indigenous healthcare system, but I know that we're not at that day and time where that's possible. So I have to really look within the structures that we do have and the systems we do have and say, like, what's possible within that in this day and time. And it's remarkable that we have people committed to supporting these changes, but I think we need to do more to, like I said, understand their potential, especially as it relates to pain. And that's one of the beautiful parts about this study, is that we are bringing people into a place where maybe they haven't had a positive experience, but maybe one that we can hopefully continue to change and alter so that it can be both and.
And it's interesting the way that you're framing it as well is that when you're bringing people into these spaces, it's not just in the context of helping care for them, helping them feel comfortable, but it feels as though there's an offering component as well.
Mhm.
It's framed through something that we talked about the other day, where essentially you're hoping that people are able to leave with something as well
Mhm.
when they're coming into that
Right.
space. And you could say it is a strategy to be more reciprocal as opposed to extractive
Yeah.
in the research and the work that you're doing. Could you maybe share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think one of the key principles is that traditional healing and connection and relationship is something that it can exist outside of the space that it was nurtured in, right? So we have that capacity to bring that knowledge and practice it relationally in other spaces and places. And one of the core principles is reciprocity. And in doing new research, one of the factors that we're doing is trying to practice ethical and meeting the moral imperatives of Indigenous health, meaning that we're not extracting knowledge and taking it and removing it from the context where it was created. But what we're trying to do is respect and honor the people who are participating. In this case, it could be Indigenous people living with pain, and looking at holding them up as knowledge holders, right? So the information that they're sharing, their lived experience, that's very important, meaningful evidence. It's information that is sacred. And so when they come in and they offer that and they share that, there has to be some way to reciprocate our appreciation for them sharing that. And we do practice certain protocols, like we do offer an honorarium for people's time, but there's other ways that you can practice reciprocity in research. And the way that we're trying to do it is by bringing people into this healing environment and practicing some of those ceremonies with them. And I think that by doing that, people can carry that and see it and feel it. And hopefully it's a healing experience. And that can be something that can help them to grow in other ways, to bring that practice outside of the traditional healing space with them.